Hello, hello, hello. My name is Kyle Van Voris with Voris.com, and today I'm going to share with you everything I know about the most important part of a cold call, the introduction. Let's dive right in. Alrighty, so typically on this channel, you see a lot of very actionable advice, a lot of tools and templates that you can use and apply today. And there'll be some of that in this video. But more importantly, I want to share with you some philosophy behind a specific part of cold calling. Because I think a lot of times people get so caught up in you should do this or you should do that, and they forget to actually think about the reason why. And once you understand the reason why, the mechanisms that are going on in a cold call that are both helping and hurting you, then you can start making decisions for yourself on what is good and isn't good. In today's video, I'm going to talk to you pretty candidly about the introduction of a cold call, that first 30 seconds, how important it is that you have a really tight introduction for your cold call. And typically when it comes to cold calling, I'm a big fan of being creative, trying different things, being open to different parts of the conversation. But when it comes to the introduction, I highly recommend you writing your introduction and sticking to it. And before I jump into what I think a good introduction looks like, I want to share with you some mistakes that I typically see folks make in their introductions. And if you like this kind of content, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps us out. The first is what I call the cliffhanger intro. And that's when you start off your call with a total cliffhanger, like, hey, this is Kyle. And then you wait and wait and wait. It's incredibly awkward. That is the worst way to start a cold call. I have never seen any prospect respond positively to the cliffhanger intro. It almost always goes like this. Hey, this is Kyle. Awkward silence.
Who?
That's how it always goes. It is not a good way to start a cold call. The second mistake I see is the introduction that I call the look at me intro. And that's when you ask the prospect if they've heard of your organization. It typically sounds like this. Hey, this is Kyle calling from Voris. Have you heard of us by chance? All right, let's break down why that isn't a good introduction. And really, I'm going to go back to a principle that I follow throughout the entire cold call and sales calls, in fact, which is what is the ideal response to that question? And does that ideal response help or hurt, and by how much? Also, how frequent is the ideal response? So in this case, hey, have you heard of us by chance? What's my best case scenario? They say, yeah, I have. I'm so glad you called. Okay. How often is that going to happen? Probably never. Most likely they're going to say no, or they're going to say, yeah, you guys call me all the time. Both of those are negative and going to be the most common. And even if the, oh, I've never heard of you by chance isn't negative, maybe it's more neutral, it's still not a great way to start off the call because you're going to talk about what you guys do anyway. So there's really no advantage of starting with, have you heard of us by chance? So why do it? The third one here is what I call the King's Jester intro. And yes, it does have a silly name. And what it's referring to is an introduction where you lead with some kind of joke right off the bat. Typically, people tell a joke about a sports team or some local thing in that area that's a little bit funny. You know, they'll make fun of LeBron James or whatever. And I just don't think that's a strong introduction. Cold calling's hard enough. To now add stand-up comedy into the mix is making it incredibly challenging. So I don't typically promote doing that. The only exception is I do like that the intro where you make fun of the fact that it is a cold call. It works for some people. I can tell you it doesn't work for others. So you got to test these out and see if it works. What that one sounds like that I actually like is this. Hey, this is Kyle calling from Voris. Look, I know you're going to hate me. This is a cold call, but do you want to roll the dice with me? A lot of times that'll get a laugh. I think it's okay. It's a relatively safe one to use, but I would not get very experimental with jokes as an intro. And I don't think they're really that necessary. If you have a really low percentage of people that are willing to open up and have a conversation with you, then maybe that's something to try and experiment with. But for the most part, a standard intro will work really well, but we'll get to that a little later in the video. Now, before I share with you the components of a strong introduction, I want to talk a bit about what's the role or what's the objective that the introduction has in a cold call. Really think about it. What are you trying to accomplish? Is it to tell the prospect who you are? Is it to try to pique their interest? Go ahead and just think about what is the role of the intro. All right, so let me share with you what the purpose of the intro is, and let's see if you got it right. The intro is there to get you into a conversation. That's the only objective of the intro. A conversation is where a cold call is won and lost. The introduction gets you into that conversation. Now, another thing that comes up often when talking about cold calling is, should you start your intro with how are you or how's it going? And there's oddly a lot of passionate dialogue around whether it's okay or not. I'm going to share with you right now, in my experience, it doesn't matter. I know they've done studies, like Gong, for example, said the best way to start a cold call is how have you been? I've also seen people use that intro and have very little success compared to how are you? The truth is every person is different. So whatever you're most comfortable with, you should use. The argument against starting the cold call with how are you is typically something like, oh, it's disingenuous. You don't actually care how the person is doing. And I would argue I do. I do genuinely care how the person is doing. It's also how I talk. And what's more important than the words that I'm saying is how I'm saying it. And if I'm uncomfortable with the introduction, it's going to set me up for failure. So I'd rather do something that I'm comfortable with. So you're going to see me when I give you the example of the ideal intro, you're going to see me asking how the person is doing. And I've tested this extensively. It does not have an impact on my success. All right, so let's talk about the two key components of a strong introduction. The first is what we call the permission-based opener. This is simply asking for permission to have a cold call. And this is what it would sound like. Hey, Melissa, this is Kyle calling from Voris. How's it going?
Good.
Great to hear. So, hey, we help organizations build and scale their inside sales teams. I'm not sure if we can help each other, but I thought it was worth a quick call. Do you mind if I ask you a couple of questions and let you decide if we should chat? And that's it. It's really simple, and it's designed to get the person to say, sure, you can ask me a couple of questions. Once you've gotten permission, then you move on to the next part of the introduction, which is what I call the path. And the goal of the path is really to give the prospect some context around the conversation and give them two roads that we can take, which will lead to a fruitful conversation that's back and forth because everybody is on the same page. And this is what it might sound like. Great. Thanks for the time. So we typically help organizations that are focused on building their first sales team, or they have a sales team already, but they're just not generating the results that they're looking for. I'm curious, which one of those resonates most with you? As you can see, I'm giving them context on how we can help, and I'm asking them to choose which one of them is most relevant to their organization. And that gives me the context I need to be able to guide the conversation in a direction that's most likely to lead to me booking a meeting. The final thing I'll say about the introduction to your cold calls is it's incredibly important that you script the introduction and do it the same way every time. There is very little room for error in the introduction. In the conversation, there's a lot more room for error. So if you never get to conversations, you're not going to be able to have the freedom you need in order to get a meeting booked. The introduction is there to get you to that conversation. Do it the exact same every single time. And if you run into a situation where you want to make a change or you think your intro could be better, change one thing and test how it works. And all you're going to do that is you're going to track the number of times that you have given the intro and track how many of those actually led to a conversation. Then you make the tweak, you test how many times you've said the intro, how many times it led to a conversation. And once you've done that enough and it's statistically significant, then change your intro and start using that one. But what a lot of folks do is they use a different intro every single time, and they'll never know what works and what doesn't work. And I don't want you to fall into that trap. And that's it, folks. Really pay attention to how you're starting off these cold calls and optimize that over time, and you're going to see a lot better results. If you want to watch another video on cold calling, we got a great one right here.